This video is sponsored by ActionVFX. ActionVFX provides some of the most premium visual effects stock footage elements I have ever used, so I'm really glad I got the opportunity to work with them. And I must say, it's really cool when someone comes along and supports something that is in the same field, in this case, ActionVFX and tutorials about VFX. They are running a Black Friday sale from November 25th at 8 p.m. EST to December 3rd, 11:59 p.m. EST, with their entire library of over 5,000 assets being at 55% off for the first 24 hours and 50% off for the remaining days of the sale. They also have 4 new premium collections and 3 new free collections coming out during this period. All annual subscription plans purchased during the sale will receive 2 times the amount of monthly elements. So, for example, if a plan gives you 30, you get 60 instead. By the way, I really love their subscription system where you can grab some elements here and there every month and slowly but surely own their entire library. But they're releasing new stuff so often, so I don't even know if you can catch up. Anyway, check the affiliate link in the description to learn more about this Black Friday sale. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the 3rd episode of Weekend Visual Effects, which is a series where we recreate effects based on different kinds of films. Today, we're gonna be creating a fireball by combining effects from After Effects and stock footage elements from ActionVFX. So let's take a look at what we're gonna be creating. Before we get started, I do want to point out a few things. First of all, environment lighting is really important when it comes to making CG elements seem like they really belong in the scene. So during shooting, I used an Aperture MC light, which I love using because they're so practical. It's one of these surprisingly very powerful but small lights. They do RGB colors, and they also have some effects presets from which I use the fire preset to simulate this orangish flickering light. And I just had the light come on as soon as the fireball was supposed to initiate. To generate the main ball element's texture, we're gonna use the good old fractal noise effect. And we're also gonna take a look at how we can unwrap that texture so that when we turn it into a sphere, it doesn't have any seams or polar issues. By the way, I already have a tutorial on my channel which covers how to create these seamless sphere textures. It's a part of a short form tutorial series, and if you want to, you can watch those tutorials by clicking the card above. Once we have the main elements set up, we're then going to combine them with some stock footage elements from ActionVFX so that everything blends together nicely. It's always good to try and combine practical elements with CG elements to achieve more realistic results. Another cool technique we're gonna cover is this lag effect, where the flames seem to linger behind as the fireball is moving left and right. One thing to point out though is that if you have a static object that sparks are supposed to come out of, then you should definitely use sparks stock footage, since they are actually very hard to replicate with CG. However, if you have a moving object, then you can't really use those spark elements because once the sparks emit, then they are no longer supposed to be tied to the movement of the fireball. So to work around that, we're gonna generate sparks by using a particle system in After Effects. You can download some of the project files for free, and ActionVFX actually provides a bunch of free packs, so check the description for those. If you have any questions or suggestions for visual effects tutorials, then make sure to leave them down below in the comments section. And with all that said, let's jump right in and get started. Alright, so here we are now in After Effects, and as you can see I have all of these folders which contain the original comps. We have the footage folder as well, which has some ActionVFX stock footage elements, and then we have the original plate folder which contains our footage that we're going to use later on. So let's drop these down and let's go ahead and get started. So we'll create a new composition by either clicking this icon down here. We can even go up to Composition, New Composition, or even use the Control-N shortcut. And by the way, we will be using a bunch of shortcuts throughout the tutorial since they do speed up the workflow, but don't worry, I will try to mention all of them. So let's click on that and we'll type in texture, since this is going to be our texture comp, and we'll unlock the aspect ratio and we'll do something like 2000 by 1000. A duration of 10 seconds seems fine, and then we'll hit OK. Now let's go to Layer, New, Solid, or you could use the Ctrl-Y shortcut, and we'll rename this to Energy, and hit OK. Now let's hit Control Space to bring up the FX Console plugin. And I've mentioned this in pretty much all of my tutorials, but it is a third-party plugin from Video Copilot, which allows you to hit Control Space to bring up this menu, and then you can type in whatever effect you want to add, and then just hit Return on the keyboard, and that just adds it to your layer, without having to use the Effects and Presets panel that comes with After Effects. It just saves you a few extra clicks, and it is totally free, so I definitely recommend that you check it out. Anyway, let's play around with a few settings here. First of all, you probably heard of the fractal noise effect. It's pretty much the go-to effect in After Effects when it comes to generating random organic looking textures. And keep in mind, when it comes to the fractal noise effect, there is really no wrong or right way to do it. It's just about experimenting with these values and seeing what you can come up with. But anyway, let's go over to the fractal type, and we'll switch over to dynamic. And this gives us more of a cloudy kind of look. Then we'll switch over to linear, which just sharpens things out a bit. And then we'll also invert the texture. So we have this sort of energy look. Then we can maybe increase the contrast a little bit, maybe 165, 170. And then go over to the overflow and just make sure this is set to clip. And this has to do with the fact that we're using 32 bits per channel, so things blend together nicely. All right, now let's also increase the complexity. So we'll do like 15, so that just adds more detail. Then we'll drop down the transform and maybe increase it a little bit. So we'll do something like 240 or 50. Then there's an option here that says offset turbulence, which basically acts as the position controller for our pattern. So if we modify the X and Y value, you can see that just moves things around. But let's just right click, reset that, and let's make sure we're on the first frame, then turn on the stopwatch for the offset turbulence, and we'll go over right at the end there, and we'll drag the Y value down so that the texture actually moves up. So we'll do something like minus 1000. So we get the impression that the fire is sort of moving upwards. Now we can also modify the evolution by either animating it manually, or we could alt click on it, and then we can type in time times 500. And this just means that every second, the evolution will cycle by 500 degrees. And with the layer selected, we'll go over to Edit, Duplicate, or use Ctrl D to just duplicate this layer. And let's rename this to Flame, since we're gonna modify these settings a little bit to get a different result. First of all, let's switch over to Dynamic Twist. Now let's go down the list here, and maybe we'll drop the brightness down a little bit. Then we'll go down to the scale and maybe decrease this a little bit. And by the way, we can select both of these and set them to screen so that they blend with each other. And we'll actually solo out the energy and maybe try to like scale it down a bit as well. So we'll go back to default. And now we'll solo the flame so we can work on that. Now another thing we could do to the animation of this second flames copy is go over to 10 seconds where the last keyframe of the offset turbulence is. And we can push it even further. So we'll go to something like minus 1500 instead. And what happens is if we bring both of those up and maybe hit T to bring up the opacity on both of them so we can see them a little bit better, they're moving upwards at different speeds. You can just barely notice it. Maybe we could even push it even further just to like demonstrate it. But that just gives it a bit more depth. But anyway, we'll go back to 10 seconds and we'll just set it back to 1500. And then we can even go down to the evolution options and just change the random seeds for some variation. All right, now let's bring these back to 100% and we'll duplicate the flames layer and we'll rename this to highlights, unsolo the other two copies. First of all, let's switch the fractal type to dynamic progressive. And again, feel free to use whatever options you want. Just because I'm using dynamic progressive doesn't mean that you have to use it as well. So keep that in mind. Now let's move down here and we'll make sure to increase the contrast a lot for this one, because what we want to do with this copy is to just isolate those highlight details around the entire texture. So we'll increase the contrast and then drop down the brightness, and then we can maybe go down to the transform and then drop down the scale as well so we have more detail. And as we're at the last frame of the composition, we could even push this to minus 2000, so even these highlights move faster, so we have even more depth between these three layers. Now let's unsolo the highlights, and just to quickly show you the issue we would run into if we were to use the allow HDR results. So if you click on that, you can see that those blacks aren't really blending with these bottom copies. I don't know why that occurs exactly, but just make sure you're in the clip overflow and that should fix your problems. Now we can also play around with the opacity of these, so maybe you can drop down the energy and the flames as well, but leave the highlights at 100% because we want those bright values. Now let's drop these down, And next up, we'll create a new adjustment layer. So we'll go over to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we'll rename this to Displacement, and then add the Turbulent Displace effect. First of all, let's set the displacement to Turbulent Smoother, and that's just so that we have a smoother pattern to use for our distortion. Now let's drop the amount a little bit, and then we can also alt-click on the stopwatch for the evolution so we can animate it again. So we'll type in time times 2000. Now you may be thinking the evolution cycle is way too intense, but do keep in mind that fire moves very chaotically, very fast, so we want to match that movement energy. Another thing we could do is maybe duplicate the turbulent displace effect and maybe drop the size down a little bit, so like very low, and then decrease this a little bit. So if we turn this on and off, you can see we just add tinier details, and we could even switch over to turbulent so it's a bit more sharp. Now, as far as the overall texture, we're pretty much set up and ready with it. Now, if we were to turn this texture into a sphere, so say we select all of them, go over to Layer, Pre-Compose, or use the Ctrl-Shift-C shortcut, and then we'll type in Texture, Pre-Comp, hit OK, and then add the CC sphere effect to it, go over to the rotation, maybe scale it up a bit. Once we rotate the X, there's these polar issues at the top and bottom of the sphere, and there's also a seam all the way at the back of the sphere, and this is because the texture is not properly unwrapped. So let's Ctrl Z to go back, and let's take a look at how we can properly unwrap our texture. And the way we can do that is by duplicating this adjustment layer. And by the way, I've actually covered what we're about to do right now in a recent tutorial on my channel, which is a part of a series where I'm doing some short form tutorials, so definitely check out that playlist. I'll make sure to include the card at the top right corner right now. So let's go over to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we'll rename this to Polar Coordinates, and we'll add the Polar Coordinates effect. And you want to make sure you're on the polar to rectangular type of conversion, and then increase the interpolation to 100%, so you can see that unwraps your texture. Now what we want to do is select the rectangle tool, zoom out here, and then we'll isolate just the top side like so. So the adjustment layer is only affecting the top side of this entire comp. Then we can hit F, and then increase the feather a little bit. Now we can duplicate this, and then we can either delete the effect here by selecting it and hitting delete, or if I Ctrl Z, we can hit Ctrl-Shift-E, and that gets rid of any effects on a single layer. So if we go back to, say, the displacement layer, instead of deleting them one by one or selecting all of them, a very cool shortcut is to use the Ctrl-Shift-E shortcut, and that just deletes everything within that layer. So let's Ctrl-Z to undo, and then we'll rename this to Mirror and add the Mirror effect. And the mirror effect is pretty self-explanatory, it just mirrors the entire comp. Delete this so you can see what's going on. We'll set the reflection angle to 90 degrees, and as we increase it, you can see what happens. We're just mirroring it vertically. And now we'll select the rectangle tool, and we want to isolate the bottom side this time. Mask it around roughly the same way as you did with the top side, and then hit F again and feather it out. And now let's duplicate this one more time, so Ctrl D and then Ctrl-Shift-E to delete that effect, and we'll add the offset effect. And let's also delete the mask. And what the offset effect does is, if we shift the X center value, you can see we're offsetting the entire texture. And so what we want to do is set this to 0 so we can actually find the seam and bring it all the way at the center. Then we'll grab the rectangle tool one last time, and then we'll isolate just the center here. But then we'll set this to subtract and hit F, and then just feather it out even more. And maybe we can double click on the mask and just scale it down a little bit like so. And what we've essentially done is located the seam by using the offset effect, and now we've masked it off and just repeated the texture. Now let's add one last effect, so we'll duplicate our adjustment layer, rename this to Unsharp, delete the effects, and we'll add the Unsharp mask effect, and also delete the mask. And what the Unsharp effect does is, it just kind of sharpens things out a bit, so it's very similar to the Sharpen effect, but it works in a more interesting way. So if we increase this to 100%, you can see it's kind of sharpening the edges of any contrasting values. If we just uncheck the visibility of it, you can see it's kind of soft, and then with the Unsharp effect, it's looking more crisp. And there you go, we're finally done with the creation of our texture. Now, to make sure we're working a bit faster, we're gonna render this out as an element, and then bring it back into After Effects, and then move on from there. So we'll hit Ctrl M to add this to the render queue. Then we'll click on the output module. We'll maybe do Format QuickTime, hit OK, set the destination, and then hit Render. Alright, now once you render out your texture and you imported it back, so you can see we have it under the renders folder. And in fact, we'll also create a new folder here that says tutorial. And we'll also drop down the comps and drag the texture comp to the tutorial folder inside the comps folder. So everything is nice and tidy. Now let's create a new composition and we'll call this ball, unlock the aspect ratio and we'll do 1080p. 10 seconds is fine and hit OK. Then we'll drag the texture layer and then we'll control space, add the CC sphere effect. And now as we increase this and go over to the rotation and just rotate it, you can see we don't have any polar issues and there is no seam. So everything is good. Now let's reset that. And first of all, let's just go down to the shading and let's set the ambient to 100% and then everything else down to 0 so we don't have any shading on our sphere. And we'll also increase the radius. Let's do 400. Now another thing we could do is maybe animate the X rotation so it constantly actually moves up. So we'll set this to 0, set a keyframe on the stopwatch, and then we'll go over to the end, and then maybe we'll do like a full cycle. So you can see it's constantly rotating and giving us the impression that it's also moving upwards. Maybe we'll even do like 2 cycles instead. And then at the beginning, we could maybe even animate the radius so it scales up. So we'll set a keyframe there, and then we'll hold down Alt and use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out of the timeline. And then we'll move forward by maybe 20 frames. So we'll go over to frame 20, and we can hit U to bring up all of the keyframes, set a keyframe there for the radius, then go back and set it down to 0 so it scales up like that. Now we could even select these keyframes, hit F9 to easy ease them, and maybe hit the graph editor here, and we can maybe select these and drag the handles. By the way, you can hold down Shift to snap it horizontally like that. And then we'll also grab this. So what happens is if we push this up, as soon as it appears, it's actually very big, and then it has a very long ease. So we can maybe drop this down a little bit. So if we preview that, maybe drop this down even lower. And now what we can do is add the turbulent displace effect to the sphere because we don't want our fireball to be so perfect. Now, first of all, let's switch to turbulent smoother. Then we'll decrease the amount a little bit and maybe decrease the size as well. And then we could also give it some evolution. So Alt click on that, time times 2000. Now we'll drop this down and hit Control D to duplicate. By the way, we'll call this ball and then we'll call this ball 2. And we'll bring this at the bottom, select both of them and set them to screen so that they blend with each other. And now we'll make some adjustments to the second copy. First of all, let's go over to the radius, hit U, make sure we're on the last keyframe. And what we want to do with this is to slightly overshoot it a little bit so the second copy is a little bit bigger than the first copy. And that way it adds a bit more dimension to it. And we could even go over to the rotation and maybe rotate it on the Y-axis so we get a different part of the sphere. Now let's go down to the displacement and let's set it to turbulent. Then we'll decrease the amount a little bit and increase the size. Then what we'll do is duplicate the turbulent displace effect and we'll decrease the size this time and then increase the amount. So it's a bit more composed towards the center and then more chaotic towards the edges. Again, I cannot stress this enough. Please feel free to experiment with these values. The purpose of these tutorials is to just show you how we're getting from point A to point B, but you can make changes along the way to make sure it suits your needs. Now, just for good measure, we'll go over to the evolution options and just randomize this for both of those copies. And then we'll drop this down. Now let's hide the first copy and we'll go over to layer, new, solid, and we'll call this matte. Hit OK, and we'll bring it right above ball 2, and we'll add the fractal noise effect. And for this one, we'll increase the contrast a little bit. Maybe we can even decrease the brightness, maybe play around with these fractal types. We can even go over to the transform scale, and we'll also animate the evolution. So one more time, time times 1000. And what we're gonna do is use this texture as a matte to reveal the ball underneath it. So instead of using alpha matte, we'll use luma matte. And what happens is this ball element is using this texture's luminance values to determine where it should be visible. So if we toggle the transparency, you can see that wherever there are bright values, the ball is visible, and wherever there are dark values, the ball is not visible. This just gives us some more variation when it comes to the visibility of this second ball instance. However, instead of using the entire layer here, let's grab the ellipse tool and you can either left click on it and this will reveal all the shapes, or you could even hit Q to toggle between them so we can find the ellipse tool. Then we'll click in the middle, hold down Control Shift, and this will make a perfect circle for you. Create a circle here that isolates the core, then we'll set it to subtract and then feather it out. By the way, we can untoggle the transparency now so you can see what's happening. So essentially what we want to do is just isolate this second copy to only be visible around the edges. Maybe even scale this up a little bit more. and then feather this out like crazy. Now for good measure, let's duplicate this and we'll delete the fractal noise effect. We'll turn it on and also make sure you go to solid settings and set the color of this to black. And we'll hit F, set the mask to add, then we'll scale it down and we'll decrease the feather as well. Now if we turn on the original ball copy, you can see that it is a lot more visible compared to the other copy. And that's what we want because we want the energy ball to be more intense towards the core and then kind of dissipate as it goes towards the edges. And by the way, if we go over to the beginning here, as the second ball is scaling up, it's revealing in a very interesting way because of this fractal noise pattern. Now we'll bring this back up and take a snapshot just to quickly show you the difference. So we'll untrack matte that, hide that. And now we're back to square zero, so we can click this button to show the snapshot and you can see the difference. Now let's create another solid. We'll make sure this one is white and we'll rename it to core. Now let's grab the ellipse tool one more time, hold down Control Shift again, and we'll click and drag here to make a perfect circle. And this is gonna serve as our core, so we'll select it, hit F, bring up the feather and then increase it a little bit. And just make sure this is like very small. And then we'll duplicate this and we'll rename this to core wide. And then we'll hit MM to bring up the mask properties. We'll increase the expansion a little bit and then we'll feather it out a bit more. So it has a very smooth fall off. Another thing we could do is hit T to bring up the opacity, alt click on it, and then add an expression which is wiggle, open parentheses, and we'll do like 10,25. And the first value is the frequency, whereas the second value is the amount. So 10 times a second, it will vibrate by 25%. And now if we click away, you can see if we solo this out, it just has this flicker to it. Whereas for the core, we don't want to touch the opacity because we want it to constantly be at 100%. Now let's drop these down. And what we'll do is also select both of those, parent them to this matte layer, hit S to bring up the scale, set a keyframe at 20 frames, so same as with the radius animation. Then we'll go back to 0 seconds and then we'll set it back to 0%. So what we're doing is just scaling this down, and since the core is parented to this, they also scale down and now everything is just coming up like so. We could even select these, hit F9, bring back the graph editor and then hold down Shift and just drag this handle. Finally, let's go ahead and start bringing in some stock footage elements. So we'll go over to Footage, ActionVFX, and you can see I've compiled all of these elements that I used in the original shot. Let's first drag this Fire Trail 5 all the way at the top. And let's go ahead and pre-compose this. So we'll go over to Layer, Pre-compose, and we'll call this Fire Trail Core, move all attributes, and hit OK. Let's add a tint effect to get rid of the colors because we're going to colorize all of these elements together all the way at the end. Now, what we're gonna do is add the polar coordinates effect, but as it is right now, once we add it and increase the interpolation, but also change the type of conversion to rect to polar, we can solo this out and you can see what we're going for, but it's not quite set up in the composition itself, so it's not really working properly. So uncheck this, and then we'll double click to go inside of the comp. And what we'll do is just position it at the top here, hit R for rotation and then spin it 180 degrees to the other side and just position it like that. Maybe rotate it like so. Then we can even scale it up. If you hold down Shift, you can scale it proportionally. So let's just make sure it's almost touching the top side and almost cutting off at the left and right sides, but just make sure it doesn't cut off. Now we can play through this just to make sure it doesn't cut off on any sides. And now if we go back, turn the polar coordinates back on, you can see they're shooting outwards instead of inwards. And that's because of the way the polar coordinates effect distorts the image. So if we go back here and bring this at the bottom and also rotate it, now it's shooting inwards. But if we Control Z, now it's shooting outwards. So in this case, just make sure your layer is sitting at the top, pointing downwards. Another thing we could do is select the pan behind tool or click Y to bring it up as a shortcut. We can set it at the base of the fire and then we can maybe stretch it out a little bit. And by the way, we can go back to the composition, lock the composition view of this ball comp. And now once we go back here, we can still see that. And if we hit S, unlink these X and Y values on the scale. If we increase the Y, because the anchor point is set to the base, it's scaling up from that point. So if we scale it up, it's just stretching even more. And this is just to show you how the polar coordinates effect behaves. But anyway, well, let's Control Z to undo and go back to what we had before. And then unlock the composition ball. Let's go back to the ball comp. Another issue we have is because the fire is not covering the entire comp, there's an empty space here. To fix that, we can easily just duplicate this fire trail core, hit R to bring up the rotation, and then just rotate it until it roughly covers that spot. And we could even just shift the timing a little bit, maybe something like that, and then just stretch this out. Finally, another effect we could add is the CC Radial Fast Blur effect, and switch the zoom mode to brightest, and we'll set the amount to like 25. So if we switch back to full, solo that out, see, it just kind of gives it a bit of a glow. And then we can copy that, so edit, copy, or Control-C, Control-V to paste. Now, if we unsolo these, just make sure these are set to screen so that they blend with each other. And we can even go over to, say, 1 second, and then select both of them and parent them back to the matte layer so that they also scale down. And you can see they're just adding a bit of energy to the core and a bit of randomness. In fact, we could hit S, bring up the scale, and just scale them up just a little bit, because they're a bit small, I think. Now let's also do a similar thing for the outer edge. So we'll go back to the footage here, and we'll drag and drop the Fire Trail 0114. Now we can also Control-Shift-C to pre-compose this, and we'll call this Fire Trail Edge. Add the tint effect one more time, add the polar coordinates effect, switch this to Rect to Polar, go over to 100%. And then we'll go inside of the comp. And for this one, we want to make sure it sits at the bottom, pointing upwards instead. So we'll set the anchor point here, hit S, scale it up a bit, and then drop it down a bit. Maybe hit R, maybe rotate it a little bit, like so. By the way, one thing we could do is maybe scale this up so it actually covers the entire comp horizontally. And then add an adjustment layer with the offset effect. And we're going to do the same thing as we did with the texture before. So we're going to locate the seam, set the X value of the shift center to 0. Then we'll grab the rectangle tool and we'll just make a tight mask, set this to subtract, and then feather it out. Just make sure it's a bit tight because we don't want to notice that repetition there. And this way, when we go back to the ball comp, solo that out for a moment, we don't have to worry about any empty spaces like we did with the core. You are going to be able to notice that these two sides are the same, but once we composite everything back together, they are not going to be noticeable. So let's set this back to screen. And it is a bit too big, so let's hold down Shift, scale it down a bit, roughly along the edge of the main ball. And we'll also add a turbulent displace effect, and let's just decrease the size a bit. And then we'll animate the evolution time times 2000. You may have noticed that I'm using 2000 for most of these evolution animations. I just found that 2000 is kind of a sweet spot when it comes to matching the speed of some fire elements. We could also parent this back to the matte. And as for the animation of this outer edge fire trail, we could get a bit creative and maybe say add the radial wipe effect. And you can see it just wipes it in a circular way, and maybe we can set this to like counterclockwise, and we'll increase the feather a lot, and then we'll go to the beginning here, set the transition completion to 0, set a keyframe, hit U to bring it up, we'll set it at the start, and then we'll go maybe to like 1 second, and we'll bring it back to 0%, and then easy ease those. And this way, not only is it scaling up, it's also revealing itself in a circular way. Bring this over. We want that to come in a bit faster, actually. By the way, we can maybe select the matte of our second instance ball and maybe decrease it a little bit. And there you go. We're finally done with the ball element. And I hope you're having a blast so far. Now let's move on to the next step, which is adding some more stock footage elements to this. So we'll click and drag the ball comp into a new comp. We'll right click, go over to composition settings, and we'll call this ball plus fire. And we'll set the width to like 1000 by 1500 and then hit OK. First off, let's colorize this by using the color vibrance effect, which is also from Video Copilot, but it is totally free. And what we can do with it is to just sample a color. So in this case, we'll do something like a orangish look. We have a few more options here, such as the vibrance, which sort of acts as the saturation, but it also shifts the hue a little bit as you increase it. So we'll leave it to 1. Then there's brightness, which we can increase a bit more. There's also gamma, which we can decrease to give it more contrast, decrease the brightness as well to 1.1. Another effect we can add is the CC Radial Fast Blur. We'll set it to brightest mode and we'll lower the amount a bit, so 30. And by the way, just now I'm noticing that the outer ball is a bit too large, so we'll go back to the ball, select this, and we'll just drop the radius down just a bit. Another thing we could do is maybe solo it out just for a moment. I want it to have a sharp edge, so its silhouette is maintained. So we can bring the brightness back up a bit, and and then increase the contrast. Just make sure the actual shape of the ball doesn't get cut off. So you can see there's the same problem down here as well. We could maybe offset the turbulence as well, try to find a better place. Another thing we could do is maybe increase the scale of this core wide so it's even broader. But then back here you can see it's kind of getting blown out to bits. So we can maybe set the brightness and gamma back to 1, and then we'll control the contrast by using a curves effect instead. So let's do something like that. Now let's go ahead and scale this down. So we'll hold down Shift, scale it down, bring it at the bottom here. What we're doing is just making some room for all the stock elements. And what's the size of this? So it's like 1000 by 1500. And for a full HD clip, this is going to be more than enough. Now let's go back to the project panel, drop down the ActionVFX stock footage elements. We'll import this torch ignition element. And if we solo this out, you can see it actually ignites at the beginning. But what we need to do is just speed it up so that it comes in a bit faster. So first off, let's just make some room on the composition timeline. So we'll make sure this is like 30 seconds long. And then we can right click, go to time, enable time remapping. And then we can maybe zoom in here and we'll find a point where it's completely ignited around here. We'll set a keyframe on the time remap. And now if we zoom out, we can select both the last keyframe and the keyframe we just created. And we'll drag this over. And what we're doing is we're speeding up this part in between these two keyframes. We can preview those together. Obviously it looks terrible right now, but we need to set this back to screen. And then one more thing we need to do is go back to the color vibrance and just make sure that this is not such a saturated color, because fire is never really that saturated in real life. So we'll just make sure we brighten it up a bit so it's like a very bright yellow. You can see how that looks a lot better now. And it's gonna help with blending these stock footage elements as well. Now we'll hit S and we'll bring it up here. We'll set the anchor point at the center of the torch. We'll bring that over there, hit S, scale it up. Another thing we could do is additionally to the ignition is also scale up the torch element. I'm also noticing that it's kind of looking weird with the time remap. So we'll maybe push this over a bit. So it's already ignited before we get to see it. And we'll scale it down to 0 as well. Now we'll add another torch element. And by the way, if you want to use the same elements, just refer to the names here. So it's torch medium wind 1. So we'll click and drag that into the comp, set it to screen, solo it out for a moment. We'll center the anchor point at the bottom. Maybe shift the timing for this towards the end. We'll center it up, increase the scale as well. Maybe we'll have this one actually be a bit smaller, just to give it some variation like so. We'll also animate the scale for this. And one thing we could do is actually trim these layers, because remember, we did set up the sphere to be pretty big as soon as it shows up. So what we need to do is just trim these so that they already start kind of scaled up at the beginning. Another effect we could use is the linear wipe effect. So if we type in linear wipe, set the wipe angle to 180, and then if we increase this, you can see that we can reveal it upwards like so, and maybe even increase the feather a little bit. And in fact, uncheck the scale, we'll go back here, increase the transition completion until we can no longer see it, set a keyframe, and then move forward a bit, and then set this back to 0%. In fact, even faster. And we'll parent this to the torch ignition. Now let's also add this small fire element. It's just about compositing different kinds of elements until we get a very dense looking fireball. Set it to screen, and we'll solo it out, set the anchor point to the bottom, and we'll also shift the timing of this as well, because it does get a bit more intense towards the end, as you can see here. And let's try to position it within the sphere. Maybe scale it up. There's an issue we have with this specific element, and that is that the base here is a bit too wide, and it's kind of going off the fireball here. So to fix that, we could maybe use a mask and cut it off. But I found that using masks is not such a good solution because the fire is kind of random and it can peek out from time to time. And then you'll be able to also notice the feather of the mask, so it doesn't really look natural. Instead, what we can do is use the mesh warp effect. Maybe lower the rows here and the columns to like 5. And now we can select this, use these points to like distort and bend it into the shape of the fireball like so. Just make sure not to go too intense with it because it can make the fire look a bit weird. By the way, when you click on these points, you can also notice that they have these curves. So you can use these to bend the distortion a bit and then just go through the timeline just to see if anything is poking out. And the mesh warp effect is really handy in this case because it helps you direct the fire in whatever way you want. You can maybe even scale it up a bit more, adjust the mesh warp as well. And then finally parent this to the torch ignition. Then we can add the same linear wipe effect, set it to 180 again. Now let's duplicate this layer because we want to replace this with a very similar element, which is the small fire 13. We can hold down Alt, click and drag on it and drop it into this layer, and that just swaps the two elements. And if we solo those out, you can see they're very similar, so we can maybe just hit R on this second one, maybe make some adjustments to the rotation, maybe even rotate this to the other side. So we have a more widely spread out flame. We want the fireball to shoot outwards in all directions. We can maybe just solo this and just mask off that part. However, do keep in mind, because we're using the mesh warp, the mask might not align. Isolate just that part there and then hit F, set it to subtract and then feather it out a bit. Now let's also add some sparks. So we have this sparks high volume and sparks mid volume. So we'll select both of those, drag them into the comp, set them to screen, and then just move them up. And these ones actually ignite at the beginning. Maybe just mask off the bottom so we can feather it out a bit. Set it to subtract so the edge is not as sharp. And we'll do the same thing for this other copy. Sorry if I'm moving a bit too quick here, but I'm just assuming that most of the things that I'm doing at this point are very elementary. And also whatever I have already mentioned throughout this tutorial, I'm probably gonna breeze past it a bit quicker. We could also set the anchor point at the bottom, scale down the high volume so there's more particles towards the center and then less particles as they go off in the distance. Then we can unsolo these, make sure they are positioned properly, maybe scale them up a bit. But not as much because they might cut off at the top there, so just keep an eye out on that. By the way, we can select all of these and this torch ignition, but not the torch medium because that is already parented to the torch ignition element. And we can parent them to the ball, and now we can slightly scale down the ball to like maybe 55, just so that we make sure nothing cuts off at the top here. And again, don't worry about the resolution of this, it's more than enough for a full HD clip. Now, one thing I want to note regarding the sparks elements, if you have a shot where the fireball is not moving, so you have a static object, then it should be fine. You can use these particles and you should definitely use them actually, because it's very hard to replicate sparks with CGI, but if there is movement, so your character is holding a fireball and it's moving the hand around, once the sparks emit, they are supposed to fly off independently. So in our case, this wouldn't work because we're gonna move the fireball around and the sparks are gonna follow around as well. Well, that will look very weird because not only is the fireball moving, but the sparks are also moving with it. So it just doesn't make sense. I just wanted to quickly point that out, but we'll get into more detail about that later. And seeing as we're on the topic of sparks, we will be using some more elements right at the start here to simulate this sort of blast as the fireball is emerging. What I have here is this Sparks Burst 1. We'll drag and drop that into the comp, set it to screen, and if we solo that and bring it up a bit, you can see it's just some sparks bursting. Now it is a bit slow, so first of all, let's just set it to like 50% speed, so it's like double the speed. And we'll also mask off the bottom, subtract it and feather it out. And now we can unsolo it and maybe reposition it and also scale it up around that point. And you can see right at the start here, there are some more particles being generated. We're gonna make this even more intense. So there's these two elements that I found, which are from the Spell Hits pack. And this one is actually free. So you can check out the website on ActionVFX and grab them for free. So we'll click and drag the first one. You can see it's this explosive sort of spell hit. First thing we need to do, obviously, is to just colorize it properly. So we'll add the hue and saturation effect, and we'll shift the hue until we get a more orangish kind of look. Then we'll also increase the saturation a bit. Then we'll also add a curves effect, boost the brightness here. Then we'll switch over to red. We'll increase the red, and then we'll switch over to blue and then decrease the blue. Then we also need to orient it properly, so you can see it's shooting this way. So we'll hit R and just align it properly. Another thing we could do is maybe chop off the first 3 or 4 frames so that it feels more explosive. And then we can set this to screen, unsolo it, bring it into position, and then we'll scale it down. And by the way, you can hold down Shift and hit P, for example, to bring up the position. And this will allow you to maintain the visibility of whatever value you have shown up here. So you have the scale, you hold down Shift, you can hit T to bring up the opacity as well, but we'll hide the opacity. And we'll set a keyframe for the position and scale here at the start. We'll scale it down, and then across 2 seconds here, we'll just scale it up, and we'll also move it up as well. So we sort of give the illusion that it's being dragged upwards by the gravity. F9, ease those, maybe bring them in closer so they happen a bit quicker. And now we can duplicate this, go back to the project panel, hold down Alt, and swap it with the spell hit side 2. And we'll hit U to bring up the keyframes, and we'll uncheck those, and we'll just parent this to that. So we only have to worry about the animation of this spell hit. But let's solo this and just make sure the orientation is set properly. So we'll hit R, and you can see we need to tweak that a little bit for this copy. And in fact, we'll hit S and maybe scale this one up a bit, and maybe even push it up. Finally, let's create a new solid. So Ctrl+Y, we'll make this black, rename this to background, and put it all the way at the bottom. And this is so we can get rid of any transparency so that later when we add some glow effects, we don't have any edge issues. Okay, so there you go. We're finally done with the creation of the fireball element. Now we can render this out, and we'll do 2 versions, one with the sparks and one without the sparks. And that's because, again, we're going to composite this on a moving character, so the sparks need to behave realistically. So what we'll do is generate those sparks by using some particle systems inside of After Effects. So let's hide the sparks elements, and we'll duplicate this comp, and we'll rename this to plus sparks, go inside of that, and then enable them here. Then we'll select both of these comps, add them to the render queue, set them both to QuickTime just like before, set the destination, and then finally hit render. Alright, so after the render was finished, I imported the files back into After Effects. I also did some cleanup. As you can see, I put all of the comps inside of this tutorial comp, which is inside of the comp. Then also all of the renders are inside of the tutorial folder, which is inside of the renders folder, which is inside of the Anyway, you get my point. It's just compception. Now we can go over to footage under the original plate folder. You can see I have the fireball footage 1080p. We can click and drag that into a new comp. And this will create a new comp based on our file's settings. So it's 10 seconds long, 1080p at 25 frames per second. We'll close the render queue. And we'll also click and drag this comp to the tutorial folder. And we'll rename this to Fireball Track, since this is where we're going to be doing the tracking. By the way, a quick tip, if you want to drop all of these down quickly, just select the search bar, hit space, and then clear that space. Now let's scrub through the timeline here and find the point where the fireball should come on. And what I want to do is trim off a few frames here just to make it seem a bit more intense. If we scrub through frame by frame, maybe we can go over at this frame, move forward by 1 frame, hit Ctrl+Shift+D, which splits the clip, and then we can move forward a bit more and we'll trim it there, and then we'll move this back here. And now if we preview this part, you can see it feels a bit more intense and the hand doesn't go down as much. Now we'll also select both of these, hit Ctrl+Shift+C to pre-compose them, and we'll call this footage. So the footage is now a single layer. And now we can track this by going over to the tracker panel. By the way, if you don't see this, you can go up to Window, and down here it says Tracker. And as a matter of fact, I'm actually going to go back to the default layout, and then go over to Window and bring that up again. So it's over here. And this way the timeline is just stretched all across the bottom side here. Now we'll select the footage one more time, go back to full, and now we can hit track motion, and this will open our footage in the layer panel. Now we can zoom in here, and we'll just scale this up a bit, something like that. And we'll bring it down. And normally what we will need to do is to track the palm, since that's where the fireball is gonna sit. But seeing as throughout the footage, these fingers actually isolate the palm and we don't really have a good point to track, what we can do instead is track the nail, which obviously is not going to give us the desired result, but you'll see how we can counter that once we get to later stages. So we'll scale this up a bit, and we'll also make sure we scale this second box a bit more, because what's happening here is the box at the center here is sort of the main box. But then this secondary box serves for analyzing whatever pixels are around this center box. So in that case, when it's tracking, it's gonna analyze as to how far, say, this pixel is from this pixel. And in turn, it's gonna be easier for it to track and also give us a better result. Now let's drag this down a bit, maybe scroll down, and we'll hit track forward. Now keep in mind, we don't need to track this all the way through. We'll just do like 5 seconds maybe. And also, if you notice that it's kind of slightly moving a bit, we could maybe go back right as it's starting to maybe shift from its point, adjust it properly and then track forward again and then stop it again and then make adjustments to it. There might be points where you have to actually hand animate it, so don't worry about that. And again, we won't track all the way through. We'll just do like 5 seconds. And you can see here, if we go back, it actually went off the nail there. So track forward. And you can even just use page up and page down to go forward and backwards by 1 frame. And you can just do this manually, especially at these parts where the hand is getting kind of blurry because of the movement. And that's because I did shoot this at 1/50th of a second. And again, because we have this large box here, it is also analyzing all of these pixels in relation to each other. So even though everything is blurry right here, it's still giving us a good track. Oops, you can see it jump there. So we need to go back and correct that. All right, let's just move a few more frames until we get to 6 seconds. And then I believe we also have to track a few frames at the beginning. So from this point on, we'll track backwards. Also, at some point, the movement here is going to get a bit too intense, so it's going to be very hard to track. So we're going to have to track it manually, and that's as much as we need. Now let's create a new null object. We'll call this track. Then we'll hit edit target, make sure it's set to the track null, hit OK, hit apply to the X and Y, and hit OK. And now if we preview this, you can see that the null is following along. Now let's find our rendered elements. We'll drag and drop both of these into the comp. We'll set them both to screen, and we'll also parent them to the track. And let's also quickly scale them down so you can see how large they are, even though we rendered them at like 1000 by 1500. And we'll hide one of these. So we'll hide the ball fire without the sparks. Say this was a static hand, so it's not moving. Well, we can use the version with the sparks, but just focus at the top of these particles. You can see they're emitting and just constantly moving with the hand, which is totally unnatural. So that's what we have to look out for. So in this case, we'll delete this and we'll use the version without the sparks and create the sparks later on so that they behave as they should. Now, the next step is to set up the lag effect. And again, this actually ties back to the movement of the hand. So in cases where you don't have a lot of movement, you can actually skip this step. Just track the ball to the track null and you're good to go. But in our case, the hand is moving quite a lot, so we want to give it that lag effect where the fire kind of lingers behind as the fireball is moving. And to do that, we need to first unparent this, and we'll right click, hit transform reset. Then we'll hit Ctrl-Shift-C to pre-compose, and we'll call this fireball puppet pin. Make sure move all attributes is checked and hit OK. We'll also set this back to screen as well. Now we'll go inside of the comp, scale it down a bit to like 50% or so, and we'll move it at the bottom here. And now we can go back. So it's roughly the size that we want it to be. And the reason we pre-compose this is so that we're going to be using the puppet pin tool to add points to this fireball. And seeing as the puppet pin tool uses coordinates based on the composition that it gets created in, we just want to make sure that the size of the fireball element as a whole is the same as the size of this fireball track composition. Trust me, it'll all make sense down the line. Now, just to give you a heads up, this upcoming part is not that complicated, but it could be a bit confusing if you don't pay attention, so feel free to pause the video at any time or even rewind back. Let's create a new null object, and we'll call this source. Then we'll duplicate this 4 times, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll rename this to position 1, this one to position 2, position 3, and position 4. Then we'll select all of these layers, hit P to bring up the position, and now we'll alt-click on the stopwatch of the first null and parent that to the position of the source. And now if we click away, what happens is if we move the source position, the position null also moves with it. But what we need to do is modify the expression a little bit, so we'll say minus, open square brackets, 0, 125. And what this is saying is, grab the same position as this source position, but just subtract it by 125 pixels in the y-axis. So these numbers in the square brackets, this is x and then this is y. So it's still gonna follow along, but it's gonna be offset by 125 pixels upwards. Now let's go back. Now let's click on the expression, select this part, and we'll Ctrl-C to copy. And now we can alt-click on the position of this position 2, parent that to the position 1, and then paste the last bit of the expression. Alt-click on this, parent it to position 2, and then alt-click on this, parent it to position 3, and again, don't forget to paste that last bit. And so what we're doing is just parenting all of these nulls to the ones below them and shifting them by 125 pixels from each other. And so now they're all moving along with the source null, but they're shifted from each other by that amount of pixels. The next step is to duplicate this null, rename this to lag1, and then we'll hit P to bring up the expression, and we'll alt click on it to get rid of the expression. Now, before we do anything else, let's go back to the source null, and we'll add a slider controller, and we'll rename this to lag1. And in fact, we'll duplicate this 3 more times so we have lag 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now let's go back to the lag1 position, alt click on it, and we'll parent this to the position 1. Now before we let go, just make sure you type in dot value at time. You can see it automatically suggests it for me. Then open parentheses, time minus, and then we'll go back to the source. We'll select it so we can see those values, and we'll go back to the expression and just make sure you're at this point in the expression, and then click and parent that to the lag1, and then one last time just close parentheses. Now it's still the same as it was before, so nothing has happened, but just to quickly demonstrate it, we'll hide all of these other nulls. We'll select the source position, hit P, and then we'll just add a quick keyframe. So we'll do a simple animation, like we'll push it to the side here. And as you can see, the lag1 is still following along. In fact, we'll switch this to cyan so we can see it a bit better. But what happens is when we increase the lag1 slider, so let's say 1, because of this expression value at time, we're making it lag behind by a value of 1. So if we preview the animation, you can see it's lagging behind by 1 second. Now, of course, you can hold down Control to have more finer control over this. So you can scroll down the value by 0.1 increments. So we'll go over to like 0.20 and see how the lag null is lagging behind. Now what we can do is just duplicate this, bring it on top of position 2, then hit P to bring up the expression and just click on it. And all we have to do is just make some modifications here because the names are the same. We just need to change the numbers. So this should be parented to position 2, and it should take into account the lag 2 slider instead. Then we duplicate it one more time, bring it above the position 3, go into this, make sure it's set to 3 and 3, and then one last time, hit P, and then 4 and 4. And you can see they all jump into their respective positions. And now if we select all of these, drop them down, go into the source and say shift all of these by 0.1 increments, so 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and 0.4, you can see what's happening. They're all following the null, but they're all lagging behind more and more. And by the way, you can even hide the position 1 null, so it's not distracting, and even switch the color of the source to something like pink there. And so now we've set up the system where the nulls are all following along and lagging behind, but how do we make it so that this null follows the track null? Let's first link these nulls to the fireball element, and then we'll link them all together to the track null. So we'll select the source and make sure we don't touch the X value because remember, the fireball is set right at the center horizontally, but it has been moved down vertically. So we'll go back to the fireball track and just increase the Y value until we're roughly at the center of the fireball, like so. Then we'll select the fireball puppet pin comp and we'll zoom in here, and now we'll grab the puppet pin tool and just try to roughly create points at the same spot as the null. So we'll do one right there, we'll move up, we'll do one right here. You don't have to be perfect with it, but the closer it is to the null, the better, because you're not gonna get any weird sort of distortion results. And then one last point. Now, if we hit U, we can bring up all of the keyframes, and seeing as the puppet pin tool adds keyframes by default, we can get to see those. Now we can delete them because we don't need keyframes. And now let's hit the tilde key to maximize the viewport. And by the way, you can do this with any viewport your mouse cursor is hovering over. So let's maximize that. Then we'll select the label group of the cyan nulls here, hit P to bring up the position for those. And what we need to do is just parent all of these puppet pin positions to those lag positions. So we'll alt click on the first one, and this one is at the bottom. So remember, this is the source, so we'll parent it to the source position. Then we'll do puppet pin 2 to lag 1, puppet pin 3 to lag 2, and so on and so forth. And now we can select all of them, drop them down, and hit the tilde key again. And you can see nothing really changed because they're all in the same spot, roughly. But now when we link the position of the source to the track, so alt click on the position and add it to the track, you can see it's following along. And depending on the amount of lag we added, those puppet pinpoints are gonna lag behind because remember, they're parented to these lag nulls, and in turn giving us this effect where the fire seems to lag behind. So you can see how cool this trick can be. It just adds another level of realism to your shot just by using this simple setup. Of course, the fireball is not positioned properly right now, and if we try to adjust the position, you'll find that we cannot. And that's normal because it is linked to the position of this. Now, if we want to adjust it, Let's say we add 2 slider controllers, so we'll duplicate one of these and we'll rename one to X and duplicate it one more time and we'll rename it to Y. Let's bring this at the bottom here and we'll set them both back to 0. Now we'll go down in the expression, make some room here, and we'll declare 2 variables. One is going to be the X equals, parent this to the X slider, type in semicolon just to keep After Effects happy. Then we'll do enter, define the Y variable, parent it to the Y slider, semicolon again. And now after this part, we're going to type in plus square brackets X comma Y. And also make sure these are the same as these because we're calling those variables now. And this way, when we let go, the source is still following the track null, but by adjusting the X and Y, we can also add to that position and in turn have the ability to move the fireball around so we can correct the position of it. So we'll do something like that, maybe move it up a bit, and there you go. Now at this point is where we're gonna see the issue of our track. So seeing as we track the nail, the perspective shifts a bit as the hand moves right and left. So we can use the X and Y values to counter that. We'll go over to the center here, or at the beginning, sorry. We'll position it properly. Then we'll move forward as the hand starts moving. We'll set keyframes for the X and Y, and then we'll move forward to the point where the hand stops, so right there. And then we'll bring this back. Then we can hit U to bring up the keyframes, and then hit F9 just to smooth them out a bit. You might have to tweak around with the timing and the easing of these keyframes, but you get the idea. And then the same thing goes when it starts coming back. So as it starts to come back, we can set keyframes again. I do remember that the timing of the fireball is actually not set up properly, so let's find the point where the fireball comes in and we'll move the fireball all the way here, so that's it. Another thing we need to take care of, if we play through the beginning here, you can see it gets kind of squashed, and that's because of the lag and the amount of movement that's happening at this point. So what we can do to fix that is we can maybe go over to this point, set a keyframe for all of these lag values, and then move back a few frames and set them all down to 0. So there's no lag at the beginning, so it just comes in normally. But then after that point, the lag becomes apparent. See if we can correct the position of that. So we'll go over to this side as soon as the hand stops moving, and we'll correct it. Again, play around with the timing and easing of these keyframes to get the track to line up properly. One more thing we could do is maybe turn on the motion blur. So let's drop these down. Select the fireball puppet pin. Hit F4 to toggle the switches. That's this button down here. And then we can turn the motion blur on, and that automatically turns it on for the comp as well. And if you zoom in here, you might find that it's a bit too blurry, and you can control the amount of motion blur by going over to composition settings under the advanced tab. And by default, it should be at 180 because that's the standard shutter angle for natural motion blur. But you can lower that down to maybe half, and that should give you half the amount of motion blur if that's something that you want. But we'll cancel that. If you want to adjust the scale of the fireball, you can go into the fireball puppet pin and then select the anchor point. You can hold down shift when you're moving the anchor point so that it snaps vertically or horizontally. And now we can move it down right there. We want to scale it up from the center because that's where the source null is based off of. We can actually lock this composition view, go back here, and then just drop down the scale. And this way you'll be able to make adjustments to it while also having the preview on. So we'll do something like 45 maybe, and then we'll unlock it. Now this might be a bit tedious every time you want to make an adjustment to the scale, so we could say set up an expression. So we'll duplicate one of the slider controllers, uncheck the stopwatch and set it back to 0. And then we'll rename this to scale, bring it at the top, and we'll lock the effect controls. So we can only see the effect controls of the source null. So even if we select anything else, those won't disappear. Then we'll go back to the fireball puppet pin, then alt click on the scale and just pick whip that to the slider. And let's just set that back to 45. And this way, we can make adjustments to it in the main comp. However, there is one issue I ran into by linking up the scale like this. So if we say make a keyframe here, hit U to bring up the keyframe, and we'll go back and say we want to scale this up. So for example, say the character actually moves a bit closer to the camera, so you want the fireball to become bigger as well. Well, if we scale this up, it's reacting, but as we move forward, it's not scaling down to the previous value. Now, I don't know why this is an issue. If we just uncheck this, go back to the fireball puppet pin and just unlink the scale, we can animate the scale here. So we can scale this up and we'll go back and we can notice it's scaling up. but it doesn't work when we link the scale through an expression here and animate this value. And I wanted to mention this just because you might find yourself in situations where you need this. So please let me know in the comment section if you have any idea as to why this is not working, so we can all help each other out. So if you need to animate the scale, just make sure you do that inside of this layer's scale. Back in the track comp, let's set the color of our footage comp to dark green and right click, set it to guide layer, because we don't want this to render in any other comps. We just want to use it here as a reference for our track. And now we'll drag and drop the fireball track into a new comp, and we'll call this comp Composite. And we'll also drag and drop the footage comp as well. Let's color code these. Also, we don't need the sound. We can even go back and copy the track and source nulls and paste them here, because we're gonna need those for some other extra stuff. Now let's move forward. Let's make sure the fireball track is set to screen. Now we'll add an effect called Solid Composite. And what this allows us to do is to add a color to a transparent layer. So in this case, we want to give it a black background. And we're doing this just so we can avoid any potential issues whenever we add those glow effects. So let's go ahead and add a glow effect. And we'll switch to half, maybe solo this out. And let's drop the intensity to very low, like 0.1. And we'll increase the radius a little bit. We can play around with the threshold just to determine how much that grabs. And then maybe increase the radius slightly. Then we'll duplicate this. For this one, we'll just increase the radius a little bit more and then duplicate it one more time and then increase it a lot more. So we get this very soft glow. You might notice here that the fireball is getting really blown out and you might think, oh man, we just added so much detail and now we don't get to see any of it. That's fine, because whenever you look at fire, you rarely get to see it in full color. Like usually all the highlights are going to be blown out. So this is actually what you want to get a realistic result. Maybe increase the threshold so that it doesn't grab as much. But for the most part, you do want that hot core. Now we can unsolo this. Now let's add a lens flare effect. So we'll create a new solid, call this lens flare. Add the effect lens flare, which is built into After Effects. Here you can control the flare brightness. Let's just set the lens type to 35mm prime. And we'll add a tint effect. And we'll map the white to sort of an orangish so that it blends with the fire. And we'll also just decrease the amount to tint to 50%. And this way we're not getting rid of all the original colors. We'll also add a CC radial fast blur effect, because I find that the lens flare effect is a bit too sharp. So if we go back to full, you can see it's very clinical looking. So we'll add a CC radial fast blur, switch back to brightest zoom mode. And we also want to make sure the center here follows the flare center. So we'll alt click on that and just parent it to the flare center. And now it should follow along. And then we'll bring up the position of the source and parent the flare center to the position of the source position. So this is one of the reasons why we needed those two nulls here as well. Finally, we can set this back to add. And you can see it's very blown out right now. But what we'll do is just have this flash at the very beginning as the fireball comes in. So right at this point, we'll set a keyframe at 0. Move forward by 3 frames. Increase the intensity. And then move forward by a few more frames and set it back to 0. Hit U, easy ease those. And then Alt square bracket to trim the layer only at that part. So now we have this sort of flash. Now let's take a look at how we can create some heat distortion. So we'll go over to layer, new adjustment layer, and this is gonna be our displacement and blur. And we'll bring it below the fireball track, and we'll add the displacement map effect and the compound blur effect. We'll shut this off for a moment and solo only the adjustment layer and the footage. What the displacement map effect does is it uses a displacement map layer and grabs the channel of whatever we set here. So it grabs its luminance channel, for example, and then displaces it by whatever amount we set here. But right now, as you can see, we're using the actual adjustment as the heat map. So we can go back to the fireball track. Now there are certain problems here, but we'll get to those in a moment. Let's also take a look at the compound blur. So let's disable the displacement map, set the fireball track as the blur map, and you can see what that does. It just blurs things out in a very interesting sort of way. But let's disable these for a moment. We'll select the fireball track, we'll duplicate that, and we'll Control-Shift-C to pre-compose it, and we'll call this heat map. Then we'll go inside of the comp, and first of all, let's just delete all of these effects. Remember the shortcut Control-Shift-E. And if we toggle the transparency, what we want to do is make sure that the fireball is completely transparent. So we'll add an effect called Luma Key. Make sure it's set to key out darker. And then we'll increase the threshold and just slightly increase it until we no longer get any black values. So we'll set it to 1. Now we'll blur it out, so fast box blur. Increase the blur just a little bit, so we soften that edge. Then we'll add a curves effect, and we'll go over to the alpha channel, and we'll just boost that a little bit. And then we'll add another fast box blur on top of that, and we'll blur this out one more time. And now finally, we'll add a fractal noise effect. First of all, just make sure the blending mode is set to none so that we don't have any color issues around the edges here. So what we're trying to do is create a matte of our fireball and then add a texture on top of all of that we can use as a heat map to generate our distortion back in the composite comp. And you'll see the results once we go back there. So let's just tweak around the settings of the fractal noise. Let's set the fractal type to dynamic twist. So we get this twisted flame look. Let's increase the contrast a lot to like maybe 300 or so. We just want to have some black spots as well. Then we'll go down to the transform and maybe scale it down a bit. We could even drop the complexity to like 4 so it's not as detailed. And then finally we'll give some animation to the evolution. So we'll do time times 2000. And now if we preview this, you can see the map is based off of the fireball, and then we're just adding the texture with the fractal noise. Let's just go back to the composite and let's hide the heat map because we don't need to see it. And under the displacement map effect, we'll select the heat map. And also seeing as we pre-composed it, we got rid of any sort of issues. And we'll set these to like 8 by 8 and just make sure we're using the luminance channel. So that's the black and white values. And now we can also turn on the compound blur, set the heat map as the blur map layer, and maybe we can just decrease this to slightly give it some blur. And as you may notice, whatever is black is not going to be blurred. Whatever is white is going to be blurred. And you can even select the fireball track here, maybe invert this to get a different result. Maybe you'll find that the heat map texture is a bit too large, so you can maybe scale down the value here. You'll get like smaller distortions. I just think that this is a bit too much, so we'll set it down to like 5 by 5. And it could be a bit too sharp. I'm not really able to tell right now because we're using half resolution, but we might want to smooth out the edges of our map here. So we can go inside of here and we can use these two instances of the fast box blur. The first one sort of acts to just extend the map, and then the second one just acts as a blur to like fade it out like so. In fact, what we could do is maybe duplicate this, and on the second copy, we could just increase the first value so it just extends a bit more, and maybe even increase this. And then also just hit T and lower the opacity to like 30%. So the distortion fall off is going to be very smooth. Now we'll move on to creating the sparks particles. Let's create a new solid and we'll call this particles. And when it comes to particle systems in After Effects, there are a few plugins that you need to consider. First of all, Trapcode Particular is, I would say, the best particle system effect when it comes to After Effects. That is something that I will use definitely if it wasn't for the tutorial, because it has a bunch of advanced features like forces, wind, and turbulence. But we are trying to keep everything as native as possible, apart from the stock footage, obviously. And when I say native, there are two particle system effects. There's the particle systems 2, and there's the particle world. They are very similar. In fact, if I just add these, they are almost identical. The main difference is that under the producer, the particle systems effect uses X and Y axes that are based on the composition's coordinates. So you can see we have X and Y. Whereas the particle world, even though it has the Z value, so it is a 3D effect, it uses its own coordinates. So that would be very problematic for us since we do need to make sure that the emitter point is tracked to the source point. So that's mainly why I decided to use the particle systems instead of the particle world effect. So we'll delete that. And now let's solo it out and start tinkering with the effect. First of all, let's go back to the beginning where the fireball comes in, and we'll solo that out as well. And let's see, where does it start coming in? So we'll drop the birth rate to 0. And at this point, we'll set a keyframe. We'll move forward by like 3 or 4 frames, and we'll set this up to like 6. And then we'll move forward 3 or more frames, and we'll set it down to 2. So basically, we're creating a bunch of particles at the beginning, and then there's less particles as they go on. Then we can decrease the longevity, so that's the life of these particles. So we'll do like 0.5. And at this point, let's just bring the position of the source up, and we'll select the position, alt-click on that, and parent that to the position of the source. Now let's go back to the particles. Let's go over to physics. We'll leave it at explosive type. Then we can change the velocity, so that's the speed of these particles. So maybe we'll bring this very low. And then we'll increase the inherent velocity a bit. And what the inherent velocity does is it pushes those particles in whatever direction they were going at. So you can see as the fireball pops up, those particles just burst upwards. So it takes into account the movement of these particles. But we'll lower that down a bit. We don't need it to be so high, maybe like 30%. And then we need to make sure the gravity is going in the negative. So we'll do like minus 2.5. So they're moving upwards. And then we'll also give it like some resistance so they're not going up as much. You can also tweak the velocity if you want to control that, or maybe even the gravity. Then we'll go down to the particle, and you can choose whatever you want here, but I just decided to go with the faded sphere. And then we'll decrease the size here just because we don't need them to be as big. So we'll do like birth size 0.02 and then death size 0.01. So they're very, very tiny. In fact, let's hide this and let's go over to full so we can see them. Also, we don't need as much size variation, so we'll drop that down to like 15%. We'll leave the opacity map to fade out because we do want them to fade out constantly. And we'll also leave the max opacity to 75%. As for the colors, let's leave them birth to death. And the default colors actually work pretty fine in this case. Now let's also add a glow effect. Make sure this one is very tight. We'll lower the intensity a bit. And then we'll duplicate it. And we'll just increase the radius for this one and also decrease the intensity. Now we can unsolo this and take a look at them with the footage. And first of all, let's just set this to screen. We could add a tint effect and maybe grab the color from these particles here. So we'll drag that. This is sort of like a very bright yellow. Decrease the amount of tint. So the tint effect is not as apparent. We still keep some shading. And then we can hit F4, turn on the motion blur as well. But if we just compare these CG particles with the real particles, you can tell that there's not much motion blur. And to be honest, now they're turned into lines, which I don't really like. So we can right click on the composite comp, go over to composition settings. And as I showed you before, you can actually drop this down to like say 45 degrees. By the way, if you want to adjust the settings here, maybe we can go back, maybe increase the velocity, gravity as well, if you want them to go further. You could even say set the depth size to 0.02, so they're not as small. Maybe even increase the birth size to 0.03. If you focus on the particles right here, and the problem we have here is that the particles are not being affected by any forces, so there's no wind to them, there's nothing. And as I mentioned before, if you were to use the trapcode particular effect, that does have its own wind system and all that stuff. But for the particle systems effect, we're gonna have to come up with a different solution. So let's solo it out for a moment. And what we'll do is add the turbulent displace effect. And as you've been seeing it throughout the tutorial, it just displaces your stuff. But we will use it this time to just simulate wind forces. And we could maybe decrease the size a little bit and maybe increase the amount. I'll click on the evolution, type in time times 1000. It just has some distortion to it, so it's a bit more chaotic, more random. All right, now let's also duplicate this so we have another copy. And we'll rename this to tight. And with this copy, we just want to give it some variation. So we'll hit a U to bring up the keyframes. First of all, we want more particles to be bursting out at the beginning, and even bring this up at the other keyframe here. And we want these to be like the tight particles that are closer to the core. So there's like more particles. We can decrease the velocity. And just for now, just so we can see things a bit more clearly, let's just disable the turbulent displace effects. We're decreasing the velocity. We're increasing the resistance as well, and we can even decrease the gravity so that they don't go up as much. And for these ones, we can go down to particle and just increase the opacity because they're a bit more intense towards the core. And in fact, we can maybe even go down to the original copy and just slightly decrease these. So you can see it's just a matter of adding as much detail as possible just to like simulate the randomness of reality. By the way, there's also these two radius options that I did forget to mention. So if we increase the radius Y, see it just spreads them out in the Y axis. And the same goes for the X axis as well. But in this case, we do want to keep it very tight to the center. Another thing we could do to help tie in this fireball with the footage is to add some environment lighting around the hand. Along with that, we also need to rotoscope the fingers here so that they sit on top of the fireball, and that way it'll look as if the fireball is sitting on the palm. And we'll demonstrate this on a single frame just because we're not gonna go ahead and rotoscope this and track the lighting on the hand from start to finish because the tutorial is already long enough. But let's go ahead and duplicate the footage, and we'll bring this all the way at the top. And we can either rotoscope our footage, or what I like to do instead is to create a new solid and call this matte. Hit F4 to toggle the switches and use that as an alpha matte, so this way we don't touch the footage. Instead, we just mask around our layer. So we'll do a rough mask here. You can also do the other finger, but we'll hit F, bring up the feather. We'll give it like 2 feather and then hit MM and we'll do like -1 in the expansion. Now to add the lighting, we'll just go over to layer, adjustment layer, add the curves effect to this. We'll just boost up the brightness. And we'll go to the red channel, maybe boost it up a bit, and then also decrease the blue channel, just to make things look a bit more orange. And then we can hit G to bring up the pen tool, and then mask around the palm here, hit F, feather it out, and then you can just bring this below the fingers comp. So we'll rename this to fingers rotoscope, and we'll also rename this to lighting hand. And in fact, we'll duplicate this, and we'll rename this to tight. And what we can do is hit MM, bring the expansion in, and also decrease the feather, but increase it on the other copy, and set this to add. If we just disable the fireball so we can see things a bit more clearly. We need to make some adjustments here, but we'll bring this back, maybe increase the expansion a little bit. And on this one, we'll also bring the expansion in a bit. So we have a more intense hotspot at the base of the fireball, and then the light fades out in the distance. Now, if you were to animate these to follow along, of course, you can animate the mask path of these masks, so hit M, set a keyframe for those. Also, you can even parent these adjustment layers to the position of the source to help automate all this track process, but I'll leave that up to you. I already did a lot of rotoscoping for the original shot, so I'm not gonna take myself through all that torture one more time. But anyway, let's take a look at a few more things we can add to our shot before we wrap this up. Let's set a marker here at our timeline. So you can do that by hitting the star key on your keyboard, just so we know this is the frame where we rotoscoped our fingers and also the lighting on the hands. Then we'll go back to the project panel and we'll click and drag the composite comp into another comp and we'll call this final. And you can see the marker showed up, so we'll go over there, hold down shift, it snaps to that marker. And we'll create a new adjustment layer, we'll call this CC. We'll add the lumetri effect. Under the creative tab, I believe I used this SL Blue Cold LUT, and maybe just lower the intensity to like 75. We could even go up to basic correction, give it some more contrast, maybe decrease the saturation. Then we could even add some noise. We could even add some handheld movement to this, so we can bring up the position, alt click on it, wiggle, open parentheses, say 2,10. And that just gives us a bit of movement, but I do find that the wiggle effect doesn't really produce natural movement. And I've actually covered this in a recent tutorial, which is also part of that short tutorial series, which I named Classroom. And again, you can click the top card, which should pop up right now. And I'll quickly just go back to the original final comp here. And I'll grab this handheld null, copy it, paste it here. And if we hit U, you can see all of these keyframes. Basically, what I did was to create a new comp in After Effects, created 2 squares, and then recorded that comp with my phone, and then brought that footage of the phone into After Effects, which I then tracked with the tracker in After Effects, and then applied that motion to this null, and then I can parent this comp to my handheld null, and maybe uncheck the expression, and now we have this very natural looking handheld movement. Of course, you would need to scale this up so that those edges don't show up. And then maybe we can even create a new null object, and we'll call this control, and we'll parent the handheld null to that null, and we can make any sort of adjustments to this. So we'll set a keyframe for the position and scale, bring them at the beginning, and then throughout 5 seconds, we can have the entire thing scale up and maybe move down a bit. Ignore the fingers rotoscope here, by the way. We can actually go back to the composite. Of course, you can double click on it to go back to it. But another thing you could do is hit tab and then click on it here, or even use the arrow keys. You can actually use the arrow keys to go back even further, like so. So that's a really cool tip. And we'll just disable this, disable the fingers as well. So we'll go back to the final. We'll close the original final, by the way. Now, one last detail I added was to give it some overall bloom. We'll duplicate this, solo it, add the Luma key effect, make sure it's set to key out darker, and we can increase the threshold a lot until we only get to see the fireball. Then we'll add a fast box blur effect and just blur it out, maybe even repeat edge pixels. And now if we unsolo this and set it to screen, and maybe just hit T, lower the opacity a little bit, and depending on how much bloom you want, you can increase this. There you go, this is without the bloom, and this is with the bloom. Maybe not so much though. but that's just an extra detail there. Especially when we rotoscope the fingers, it kind of helps bleed the light into the fingers as well. Keep in mind that this might not be so render friendly since we're duplicating the composite comp, which contains those fireball elements and all those particle elements. And so you multiply that by 2 and your PC could catch on fire. So it might be best to maybe render this final comp without the bloom and then do the bloom after the fact in another final comp. So final_final_finalception. Alright guys, so we finally reached the end of this tutorial, and with all that said, let's move on to the outro of this video. Alright guys, that was all for today's tutorial. Thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Remember, you can download some of the project files for free, and also don't forget to visit ActionVFX through the affiliate link in the description to make good use of their Black Friday sale. If you have any questions or suggestions for visual effects tutorials, then make sure to leave them down below in the comments section. Also, if you'd like to see more videos like these, then consider subscribing because it does help out the channel, and also hit that bell button to be notified whenever a new video comes out. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time.